My son looked at me across a table worth more than my entire house and smiled as if he was doing me a favor. Then he said, loud enough for every guest in his mansion to hear, "Mom, this table is for family who built something, not for people who have nothing." The room fell silent. My granddaughter Sophie burst into tears. My daughter-in-law looked away, and my own son pointed toward a small folding table set up near the kitchen. I felt my heart break, but I didn't argue. I stood up, picked up my purse, and quietly said, "All right." An hour later, sitting alone in my car under a dark Chicago sky, I made a phone call I had hoped I would never have to make. "Robert," I said to my lawyer, "it's time. If you've ever been hurt by someone you loved, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe if stories about family, resilience, and second chances speak to you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it there right now? And what would you have done if your own child treated you this way?" There was a time when I believed that if you loved your child enough, they would always remember it. At 67 years old, I knew better. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I live alone in a modest 2-bedroom house outside Columbus, Ohio. The house isn't impressive. The paint on the porch could use touching up, and the kitchen cabinets are older than some of my neighbors' grandchildren. But every corner of that house carries a memory. It was where my husband Richard and I raised our son. It was where we celebrated birthdays, survived hard winters, and dreamed about the future. Most importantly, it was paid for after Richard passed away 3 years earlier. Many people expected me to move into something larger or closer to family. I could have. Instead, I chose simplicity. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. I shopped with coupons. I grew tomatoes in my backyard. I donated more clothes than I bought. The truth was, I liked my quiet life. Unfortunately, my son Daniel saw things differently. Daniel lived in Chicago with his wife Vanessa and their daughter Sophie. He owned a successful investment company and spent a great deal of time making sure everyone knew it. His social media accounts were filled with luxury vacations, expensive restaurants, designer watches, and photos of charity galas where people congratulated one another for writing checks while photographers captured every angle. Sometimes I looked at those pictures and wondered when my son had become a stranger. The invitation to his dinner party arrived 2 weeks before. Vanessa had called. "We're hosting something special," she said. "A lot of important people will be there." Important people. I noticed she didn't mention family first. Still, I agreed to come. Part of being a mother is continuing to show up, even when your heart warns you not to. The drive from Ohio to Chicago took several hours. I packed carefully. A navy blue dress, a light cardigan, comfortable shoes, nothing expensive, nothing flashy, just me. When I finally pulled into Daniel's neighborhood, I immediately felt out of place. The homes looked less like houses and more like private resorts. Perfect lawns, massive gates, luxury cars lined along the streets. Daniel's mansion sat at the end of a curved driveway, illuminated by elegant landscape lighting. I parked my aging sedan between a Bentley and a Mercedes. My car looked like it had wandered into the wrong movie set. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly wanted to turn around and go home. But then I thought about Sophie. My granddaughter was the brightest part of every family gathering. She still called me every Sunday. She still mailed handmade birthday cards. She still hugged me as though I mattered. So I got out of the car and walked toward the front entrance. The door opened before I could knock. A young valet smiled politely. "Good evening." I stepped inside. The house was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The smell of expensive catered food drifted through the air. Guests stood in groups holding wine glasses and discussing business deals. No one looked relaxed. Everyone looked like they were performing. I spotted Vanessa first. She wore a silver designer gown and enough jewelry to finance a college education. Her smile appeared the moment she saw me. Unfortunately, it never reached her eyes. "Eleanor," she said. "Not Mom, not Eleanor. It's wonderful to see you. Just Eleanor, as though I were another guest." "You made it." "I said I would." She kissed the air near my cheek. "We're expecting a lot of investors tonight." "I gathered that." She glanced briefly at my dress. Just 1 second. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. That quick little inspection told me everything. I wasn't dressed incorrectly. I simply wasn't dressed expensively. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked. "No, thank you." "Well, enjoy yourself." And just like that, she disappeared. No conversation, no warmth, no effort. I stood alone near the entrance. A few guests glanced at me. One woman smiled politely. Another seemed confused about who I was. I overheard someone whisper, "Is that his mother?" The other person answered, "I think so." The tone wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was dismissive, as though they were discussing a piece of furniture. I moved toward a quieter area near the windows. For a while, I simply watched. Daniel moved confidently through the room, laughing, shaking hands, accepting compliments. He looked successful. He looked powerful. He looked exactly like the kind of man he always dreamed of becoming. Yet something was missing. Richard used to say that true confidence made people kinder. Daniel's success seemed to have made him harder. Then I felt 2 small arms wrap around my waist. "Grandma." I turned and smiled instantly. Sophie. 12 years old. Bright eyes. Dark hair. The same warm heart she'd always had. "There you are." She hugged me tightly. A real hug. The kind that heals something inside you. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you too." She pulled back and looked at me. "You look beautiful." I laughed softly. "You're very sweet." "No, really." She lowered her voice. "You always look happier than everyone else here." I glanced around the room. She wasn't entirely wrong. "How have you been?" I asked. She shrugged. "Okay. Not great. Not terrible. Just okay." The answer bothered me. Before I could ask more, Vanessa appeared. "Sophie." The girl's shoulders immediately stiffened. "Go say hello to the Hendersons." "But now." Sophie looked at me apologetically. Then she walked away. I watched her go. Something about that exchange stayed with me. Children often reveal truths adults try to hide. And Sophie hadn't looked happy. As the evening continued, more guests arrived. The atmosphere became increasingly formal. Servers moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers. A jazz trio played softly in the background. Everything was elegant. Everything was expensive. And somehow, everything felt cold. Eventually, I found myself standing alone near one of the dining room entrances. That's when I noticed something strange. The main dining table had been prepared with exquisite detail. Crystal glasses, personalized place cards, fresh floral arrangements. There were enough seats for everyone important. Everyone except one. I frowned. Because off to the side, near the kitchen entrance, sat a small folding table with a single chair. At first, I assumed it was for staff. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A place card rested on top. It read, Eleanor Hayes. I stared at it. Surely there had been a mistake. No mother would be seated separately from her family. Not intentionally. I looked toward the main table. Daniel stood laughing with several investors. Vanessa was directing servers. Neither seemed concerned. Neither seemed surprised. A terrible feeling settled in my chest. The same feeling I had experienced when Richard's doctor entered the hospital room years ago. The feeling that something bad was coming. Something life-changing. Something that couldn't be taken back once it happened. I looked again at that lonely chair near the kitchen. Then at the beautifully decorated family table. And for the first time that evening, I realized I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't misreading the room. I wasn't truly welcome here. And deep down, I knew the worst part of the night hadn't happened yet. I stood there, staring at the place card with my name on it. Eleanor Hayes. The words looked innocent enough, but sitting alone at a folding table near the kitchen wasn't an accident. It was a message. And the more I looked around the dining room, the more certain I became that everyone else already knew it. The main table stretched across the center of the room like something from a luxury magazine. Fresh white roses decorated the middle. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandelier. Each seat had been assigned carefully. Investors, business partners, local politicians, a few distant relatives. Daniel and Vanessa sat at the center. The position of honor, the position of power. And then there was me, a lonely chair tucked beside a service door, where catering staff moved in and out. For a brief moment, I considered leaving. I could have slipped out quietly, driven back to Ohio, pretended none of this had happened. But another part of me wanted to hear Daniel explain it. I wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding. After all, this was my son, the little boy who once crawled into my lap after nightmares, the teenager who cried when his first girlfriend broke his heart, the young man who promised me he would never forget where he came from. Surely there had to be some explanation. I was still trying to convince myself when I noticed movement near the table. A catering employee approached my chair. He looked uncomfortable. Ma'am? Yes. I was told to remove this chair. I stared at him. Remove it. Yes. His face turned red. I'm sorry. Before I could respond, he lifted the chair and carried it away. The place card remained, But now, there wasn't even a seat. The room seemed to tilt slightly. For a second, I wondered if I had heard him correctly. Then I noticed several nearby guests watching. Not openly, not obviously, but enough. People knew. People were waiting, watching, curious to see how this strange little family drama would unfold. I felt heat rise into my face. Humiliation is a peculiar kind of pain. It doesn't wound the body. It wounds dignity. And somehow, that hurts more. I looked around for Daniel. He was standing near the head of the table, laughing with several men in expensive suits. One of them clapped him on the shoulder. Another raised a glass. Daniel looked happy, proud, completely unaware or completely unconcerned about what was happening. Then Vanessa approached him. She leaned toward his ear and whispered something. Daniel glanced in my direction. Our eyes met. For just a second. Then he looked away. That hurt more than anything, because it told me he knew. Every bit of it. The folding table, the missing chair, the embarrassment. All of it. Intentional. A few minutes later, dinner officially began. Guests found their assigned seats. Servers poured wine. Conversations filled the room. I remained standing near the wall. Nobody offered me a chair. Nobody asked if there had been a mistake. Nobody wanted to become involved. Then Daniel tapped a spoon against his glass. The room quieted immediately. He stood, smiling, confident. The successful businessman, the admired host. "My friends," he began. "Thank you for being here tonight." Applause followed. Daniel continued. He talked about growth, success, achievement. He spoke about his company, recent investments, future opportunities. The guests nodded approvingly. Several people raised their glasses. Then his speech shifted. "I've always believed something important." His voice grew stronger. "Success isn't an accident." More nodding. More smiles. "You earn your place in life." I felt my stomach tighten. Something about his tone suddenly felt dangerous. Daniel continued. "The people sitting at this table tonight are people who built something." A few guests laughed proudly. Others applauded. Then Daniel looked directly at me. The room followed his gaze. Every eye landed on me. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. Every second of it. Daniel smiled. The same charming smile he used during business presentations. "Some people spend their lives creating value." A few people chuckled. Others simply exist. Silence. The smile remained on his face. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Mom, this table is for family who built something, not for people who have nothing." The room froze. Every sound disappeared. No forks, no glasses, no conversation, nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that arrives after something unforgivable. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. But then I saw the reactions around the room. Several guests looked horrified. Others stared at the table. Nobody laughed. Nobody joined in. Even people who barely knew me seemed uncomfortable. Because some lines should never be crossed, and a son humiliating his mother publicly was one of them. I looked at Daniel, waiting, hoping, praying he would smile and say it was a joke. A terrible joke, but a joke. Instead, he simply stood there, confident, certain, as though he expected everyone to agree. Then I heard a small voice. "That's not true." Sophie, my granddaughter, was standing beside her chair. Tears filled her eyes. "Grandma helped everybody." The room became even quieter. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Sophie." "No." She shook her head. "That's mean." Vanessa immediately stood. "Sophie, sit down." "But Grandma." "Sit down." The girl's face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks. My heart shattered. Not because of Daniel, because of her. Because a child was being forced to watch her father become someone she didn't recognize. Someone I barely recognized. I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay. But the words wouldn't come. I looked around the room one final time. The investors, the guests, the expensive decorations, the beautiful mansion, and my son sitting at the center of it all. For years, I had worried that success might change him. Now I knew it had. The saddest part wasn't what he said. It was what he believed. Daniel truly thought money determined a person's worth. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten every lesson Richard and I tried to teach him. Character, kindness, gratitude, respect, especially respect for family. Most especially respect for the people who sacrificed for you. I felt tears threatening to appear, but I refused. I would not give him that satisfaction. Not here. Not in front of these people. Slowly, I picked up my purse. The movement seemed to surprise everyone. Daniel watched, perhaps expecting an argument, perhaps expecting tears, perhaps expecting me to beg for dignity. Instead, I simply stood, straightened my shoulders, and looked directly at my son. The room waited. No one moved. No one spoke. I could see uncertainty beginning to creep into Daniel's expression, because bullies expect resistance. They don't know what to do with calm. Finally, I nodded, just once. "All right." 2 simple words. Nothing more. I turned and walked toward the front door. Behind me, Sophie called out, "Grandma!" I nearly stopped. Nearly. But if I looked back, I wasn't sure I could keep walking. So I continued forward. Past the marble floors, past the crystal chandeliers, past the shocked guests, past the life my son had built. And as I stepped out into the cold Chicago night, I felt something inside me change. Not anger, not revenge. Something quieter, something final. For the first time in my life, I accepted a truth I had spent years avoiding. My son had made a choice, and before the night was over, I would make mine. The cold night air hit my face the moment I stepped outside Daniel's mansion. For a few seconds, I simply stood there. The sounds of laughter and conversation continued behind the enormous front doors as if nothing had happened, as if a son hadn't just humiliated his mother in front of an entire room, as if my heart hadn't been broken. I walked slowly to my car. Each step felt strangely calm. Not because I wasn't hurting, I was. The pain sat heavily in my chest. But something else had replaced the shock. Acceptance. A painful, undeniable acceptance. When someone shows you who they are, eventually you have to believe them. I climbed into my old sedan and closed the door. The silence was immediate. No music, no voices, no judgmental stares. Just me. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. I thought I might cry. Instead, I stared through the windshield, and memories began flooding back. Not the painful memories, the good ones, the ones mothers carry forever. I remembered Daniel at 6 years old, his front tooth missing, his knees always scraped, his pockets always filled with rocks he thought were treasures. I remembered him running into my arms after school. I remembered helping him build science projects. I remembered staying awake beside his bed when he had pneumonia. I remembered every sacrifice, every worry, every prayer. And suddenly, one question echoed inside my mind. How had we gotten here? I started the engine. The drive away from the mansion felt surreal. Chicago's lights blurred through the windshield. Luxury stores, office towers, upscale restaurants. Everything Daniel admired, everything he had spent years chasing. I wasn't against success. Richard and I had worked hard our entire lives. We respected ambition. What we never respected was arrogance. There was a difference, a huge difference. One builds, the other destroys. An hour later, I found myself parked beside a quiet lake on the outskirts of the city. The water reflected the moonlight. No traffic, no people, just silence. I turned off the engine. Then I reached into my purse and removed my phone. My fingers hesitated over one contact. Robert Whitman. For a long moment, I simply stared at his name. I had known Robert for nearly 40 years. He wasn't just our attorney. He had been Richard's closest friend. The three of us had shared countless dinners together. When Richard passed away, Robert had helped me navigate every legal detail. More importantly, he had helped me survive the grief. He understood our family better than almost anyone. I pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then Robert answered. Eleanor. His voice sounded calm, steady, as if he already knew it was me. I swallowed hard. Robert? A brief silence followed. Then he asked the question. Did it happen? Not hello? Not how are you? Did it happen? The question sent a chill through me, because suddenly I realized something. Robert had been expecting this call. For years. I closed my eyes. Yes. Another pause. A long one. I see. His voice carried sadness. Not surprise, just sadness. I stared at the dark lake. He did it in front of everyone. Robert sighed quietly. I'm sorry. So am I. More silence. Then Robert spoke carefully. Are you absolutely sure? I knew exactly what he meant. The decision, the one Richard and I had discussed years ago, the one we hoped would never become necessary. I looked across the water, thought about Daniel, thought about Sophie, thought about the empty chair, the folding table, the words he'd spoken. And then I answered. He made his choice tonight. The line remained silent. Finally, Robert spoke. Then it's time. A strange ache spread through my chest. Because hearing those words made everything feel real. There would be no going back. Not after this. Not completely. I leaned back against the seat. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Robert said softly, Richard was afraid of this. My eyes opened. What do you mean? You know what I mean. Of course I did. Years earlier, Richard had noticed changes in Daniel long before I had. At the time, I thought he was worrying too much. Now I wished I had listened. I remembered one conversation in particular. It happened shortly after Daniel sold his first company. He'd become wealthy almost overnight. That evening, Richard and I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset. Daniel had just left after bragging about a luxury watch he'd purchased. I laughed it off. Richard didn't. Money is changing him, he said. I remember rolling my eyes. He's excited. No, Richard shook his head. He's forgetting. Forgetting what? Who helped him get there? I hadn't wanted to hear it. Mothers rarely do. We want to believe the best. We want to believe our children will eventually find their way back. But Richard had seen something I refused to see. Pride. Dangerous pride. The kind that convinces people they earned everything entirely on their own. The kind that erases gratitude. Back in the present. I wiped away a tear. I thought he'd grow out of it. So did Richard. I looked at the dark water again. Maybe we both made excuses. Parents often do. His words weren't cruel. They were true. I sighed deeply. What happens now? Robert's tone became professional. Tomorrow morning. I begin the process. My stomach tightened. Even though I knew this conversation was coming, even though I had initiated it, the reality still hurt. How long? Not long. And Daniel? He'll receive notice. I nodded. Not that Robert could see it. The notice. The beginning. The first domino. The thing Daniel never imagined would arrive. Part of me wanted to warn him. Part of me wanted to call him immediately. Tell him to apologize. Tell him to fix this. Tell him there was still time. But another part of me knew the truth. If he apologized now, it wouldn't be because he was sorry. It would be because he was afraid. Fear isn't the same thing as remorse. And for the first time in my life, I needed to stop protecting my son from the consequences of his choices. Robert cleared his throat. There's something else, What? The documents. I immediately understood. The documents. The ones Richard had signed. The ones Daniel had never fully understood. The ones that would soon change everything. Have you reviewed them recently? Robert asked. No. Perhaps it's time. A chill moved through me, not because I feared what was inside, because I remembered why Richard created them. Back then, I'd argued against it. I thought he was being overly cautious, paranoid, even. Richard disagreed. If Daniel stays humble, he had told me, none of this will ever matter. And if he doesn't, Richard had stared out toward the yard, then answered quietly, then you'll need protection. At the time, I believed such a day would never come. Tonight proved otherwise. I looked up at the stars. The same stars Richard and I used to watch together. The same stars that had witnessed our entire marriage. Our struggles. Our victories. Our dreams for our son. A tear finally escaped. Then another. Not because I was angry. Because I was grieving. The Daniel I loved still existed somewhere. I wanted to believe that, but the man standing in that dining room tonight wasn't the boy Richard and I raised. Not anymore. Robert's voice softened. Eleanor. Yes. You don't have to decide everything tonight. I looked toward the horizon. The moon reflected across the lake like a silver path. No, I said quietly. I think I already have. And as I ended the call, I realized something that frightened me. The humiliation at dinner wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And very soon, Daniel Hayes was about to discover a truth his father had hidden for years. A truth that could cost him far more than money. I barely slept that night. By the time I arrived home in Ohio the next afternoon, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. But it wasn't physical exhaustion. It was emotional. The kind that comes from carrying decades of memories and suddenly questioning all of them. My house greeted me with familiar silence. No marble floors. No chandeliers. A mess. No catering staff. Just the soft creak of old wood and the scent of lavender from the candles I kept near the kitchen window. For the first time in years, I stood in the middle of my living room and wondered whether Daniel had ever truly understood what it had cost to give him the life he enjoyed. The answer came almost immediately. No, he hadn't, and perhaps that was partly my fault. I had spent my entire life protecting him from hardship. Children rarely see the sacrifices made behind closed doors. They see the finished result, not the struggle, not the fear, not the sleepless nights. They see the graduation diploma, not the mother who worked overtime to pay tuition. They see the successful business, not the parents who risked everything to help launch it. Daniel had spent years believing his success began with him. The truth was very different. That afternoon, I opened a storage box in the hallway closet. Inside were dozens of old photo albums, receipts, letters, documents, fragments of a life Richard and I had built together. I carried everything to the dining room table. As I opened the first album, memories came rushing back. Daniel was 8 years old in the first photograph. His smile was missing 2 front teeth. He held a Little League trophy almost as large as his torso. I remembered that season vividly, not because of baseball, because that was the year Richard lost his job. The manufacturing company he'd worked for nearly 20 years had closed unexpectedly. Hundreds of employees were laid off, including him, overnight. Our family went from comfortable to terrified. I still remembered the look on Richard's face when he walked through the front door carrying a cardboard box. For the first time in our marriage, I saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, for us, for Daniel, for the future. That night, after Daniel went to bed, Richard sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "We're going to lose everything." I grabbed his hand. "No, you don't understand." "I do." "No, Eleanor." His voice cracked. "We could lose the house." I remember squeezing his fingers. "We won't." At the time, I had no idea how we'd survive. But I knew one thing. Panic wouldn't save us. Action might. The next morning, I took a second job. 2 weeks later, I took a third. During the day, I worked at a medical office. In the evenings, I helped with bookkeeping for a local business. On weekends, I cleaned vacation rentals. For nearly 4 years. I barely slept. I wasn't unique. Millions of mothers make sacrifices every day. But Daniel never knew the extent of it. Richard and I made sure of that. We wanted him focused on school, focused on building a future, not worrying about bills. As I turned another page, I found a photograph from Daniel's high school graduation. I smiled despite myself. He looked so proud, so hopeful. The first person in our family accepted to a major university. What Daniel never knew was that 2 months before that graduation, I sold something precious. I stood and walked toward my bedroom. Inside my dresser sat a small velvet box. It was empty now, had been for years, but I still kept it. Inside that box had once been my grandmother's jewelry, family heirlooms passed down through generations. A necklace, a bracelet, a pair of earrings. Nothing worth millions, but priceless to me. I sold every piece. Not because I wanted to, because Daniel's tuition bill arrived. Financial aid wasn't enough. Scholarships weren't enough. And there was no way I was letting my son lose his opportunity. I remember sitting in my car after leaving the jewelry store, crying quietly. Not because I'd lost the jewelry, because I hoped the sacrifice would matter, because I hoped Daniel would use that opportunity well. And he did, at least for a while. Back at the table, I opened another folder. This one contained bank records, loan agreements, business documents. The story Daniel never knew. After college, he decided to launch a financial consulting company. He was brilliant, driven, ambitious. Unfortunately, ambition doesn't pay startup expenses. Banks weren't interested. Investors weren't interested. Everyone said he lacked experience. Daniel came home furious. I still remember that conversation. "No one believes in me." Richard looked at me. I looked at Richard. We didn't need words. We'd already made our decision. A week later, we refinanced our house. We never told Daniel. Not completely. He knew we helped. He didn't know how much. He thought we contributed a small amount. The truth was terrifying. If his business failed, we could have lost our home. Everything. Every dollar we had spent decades building. But we believed in our son. So we signed the paperwork and prayed. Fortunately, Daniel succeeded. His company grew quickly, then exploded. Within 10 years, he became wealthy. Within 15 years, he became extremely wealthy. And somewhere along the journey, the story changed. At least in his mind. Gradually, the sacrifices disappeared. The support disappeared. The risk disappeared. Only his success remained. He began telling people he built everything himself. At first, it bothered me. Then I convinced myself it didn't matter. Parents don't need recognition. At least, that's what I told myself. Now I wasn't so sure. I reached for another document. This one stopped me cold. It was an old handwritten letter. Richard's handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly. I unfolded the paper. The date was nearly 12 years old. The letter had never been mailed. Richard had written it for Daniel, perhaps intending to give it to him one day, perhaps never finding the right moment. I began reading. Daniel, if you're reading this, I hope you're successful. More importantly, I hope you're kind. Money is useful. Success is admirable. But neither matters if you lose your character. Never forget the people who stood beside you before anyone knew your name. Never confuse wealth with worth. And never believe that your accomplishments happened entirely on your own. No one reaches the top alone. I stopped reading. Tears filled my eyes. Because Richard had seen the danger years before I did. He understood something I refused to acknowledge. Daniel wasn't struggling with money. He was struggling with gratitude. And gratitude, once lost, can destroy a person. I folded the letter carefully, then placed it back inside the folder. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through my dining room window. Dust particles floated through the air. The house felt quiet, peaceful. Yet beneath that peace, something else was growing. Resolve. For years, I had protected Daniel from consequences, protected his reputation, protected his feelings, protected his image. Even after he stopped protecting mine, that chapter was ending. Not because I stopped loving him, because I loved him enough to stop enabling him. My phone buzzed suddenly. A text message appeared. For one brief moment, I hoped it might be Daniel. It wasn't. It was Robert Whitman. The message contained only one sentence. I've reviewed everything. Daniel never knew the full truth. I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. And when he finds out, it will change everything. A chill moved through me. Because I knew Robert wasn't talking about the money. He was talking about something much bigger. Something Richard had hidden for years. Something Daniel was about to discover. 3 days after the dinner party, I found myself sitting across from Robert Whitman in his office. The office hadn't changed much in 40 years. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls. Legal books filled every available space. Family photographs sat on the corner of his desk. One of them included Richard. The sight of my husband still caught me off guard sometimes. even after 3 years. Robert noticed me looking. He'd hate this. I smiled sadly. Yes. He always believed Daniel would figure things out. So did I. Robert nodded. Then his expression became serious. Unfortunately, belief and reality aren't always the same thing. The large file sitting between us seemed heavier than paper should. Inside that file existed a secret Daniel had never fully understood. A secret Richard had carefully built years before. Robert slowly opened the folder. I think it's time you review everything. I stared at the documents. Part of me wanted to avoid it. The same way people avoid looking at medical test results when they already suspect the diagnosis. But avoiding reality never changes reality. So, I nodded. Show me. Robert removed the first document. I recognized it immediately. Richard's estate plan. Most people imagine wills as simple documents. Who gets the house? Who gets the money? Who inherits the jewelry? Richard's estate plan was different, much more complicated, much more intentional. And now I understood why. Robert adjusted his glasses. Do you remember the conversation after Daniel sold his second company? I nodded slowly. Of course I remembered. That had been nearly 8 years ago. Daniel's wealth had exploded. His confidence had exploded with it. At first we celebrated. Then we started noticing changes. Small changes. The dangerous kind. He interrupted people more often. Talked about money constantly. Dismissed anyone who wasn't successful. Measured value through income, status, connections. One evening, after Daniel left our house, Richard sat silently for nearly an hour. Finally, he spoke. We need protection. I laughed at the time. Protection from our own son. Possibly. I thought he was overreacting. Now I wished I had listened more carefully. Robert slid another document across the desk. This was the result. I read slowly. The language was technical, legal, complex, but the meaning became clear quickly. Richard had structured a large portion of the family assets through trusts and protected entities, not because he didn't trust Daniel, because he didn't trust what success might do to him. My stomach tightened. Even after all these years, seeing it written down felt surreal. Robert continued. Richard wanted Daniel to benefit from the assets, but not own them completely. Correct. I looked up, and I was named supervising trustee. You were... I already knew that part. What I hadn't fully appreciated was the extent of the authority. Robert opened another file. Inside were property records, investment holdings, partnership agreements, a web of legal protections Richard had spent years creating. Then Robert pointed to one page. This is the important section. I began reading. Twice? 3 times? The wording was unmistakable. Family Stewardship Clause. A phrase Richard personally insisted upon. The clause required heirs to demonstrate conduct consistent with preserving family values. Respect, integrity, responsibility, protection of family relationships. Failure to uphold those principles could trigger review and removal of certain control rights. I stared at the page. Years ago, it sounded unnecessary. Now it sounded prophetic. Robert leaned back. Richard believed wealth should serve family, not replace it. I finished the sentence for him. He nodded. Exactly. The room fell silent. Then Robert reached for another document. This one changed everything. Eleanor. His voice lowered slightly. There is something Daniel never understood. My pulse quickened. What? Robert slid several property records toward me. I examined them carefully. At first, I didn't see it. Then I did. My eyes widened. Oh my God. The Chicago mansion. The Aspen vacation property. Several investment holdings. A significant percentage of ownership never belonged directly to Daniel. Not fully. Not legally. The controlling authority ultimately flowed through the family trust. And the supervising trustee. Me. For years, Daniel had behaved as though everything belonged entirely to him. Technically, it didn't. Not in the way he believed. I sat back slowly. A mixture of shock and sadness washed over me. Not because of the assets, because of what they represented. Richard hadn't built these protections to punish our son. He built them because he loved him, because he feared what unchecked power might become, because he wanted someone standing guard. That someone was me. Robert folded his hands. If you activate the review process, Daniel will receive formal notice. I nodded. What happens next? He'll undergo a fiduciary review. And if he fails? Robert hesitated, then answered honestly. He loses control. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Final. Terrifying. I looked out the office window. Traffic moved below. People hurried along sidewalks. Normal lives. Normal problems. Meanwhile, my family stood on the edge of something irreversible. What would Richard do? I asked quietly. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied me. Eleanor, what? You already know. Maybe I did. Richard wasn't vindictive. Never had been. But he also believed actions mattered. Choices mattered. Character mattered. Perhaps more than anything else. The office phone suddenly rang. Robert ignored it. His assistant would answer. He remained focused on me. There is one more thing. The words instantly raised my anxiety. What now? Robert opened another folder. This one was thinner. Inside sat a collection of reports, financial summaries, transaction histories, asset reviews. I frowned. What's this? Recent audits. I flipped through several pages, then froze. Certain transactions looked unusual. Large withdrawals, transfers, asset movements. None authorized through the normal family channels. My eyes narrowed. Who initiated these? Robert's expression darkened. We're still investigating. Daniel? We don't believe so? A chill moved through me. If not Daniel, then who? I continued reviewing the documents. Several transactions involved entities connected to Vanessa. The amounts weren't enormous, at least not compared to Daniel's fortune, but they were significant enough to raise concerns. And more importantly, they were hidden, carefully hidden. I looked up slowly. Does Daniel know? We're not certain. That answer frightened me more than any other, because it suggested two possibilities. Either Daniel knew and participated, or he was being manipulated. Neither possibility ended well. Robert closed the file. "We'll know more soon." I sat quietly, processing everything: the family trust, Richard's protections, Daniel's fragile position, Vanessa's suspicious activity, the humiliation at the dinner. Every piece felt connected somehow, like a puzzle approaching completion. But several pieces were still missing, and those missing pieces worried me most. My phone vibrated. A text message. "Daniel, the first contact since the dinner." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I opened it. "Mom, we need to talk." No apology, no acknowledgement, no regret, just those 4 words. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. The message wasn't from a son worried about hurting his mother. It was from a businessman sensing a problem. I typed nothing. Instead, I locked the screen. Robert noticed. "Daniel." I nodded. "What did he say?" "We need to talk." Robert sighed. "Still no apology." "No." Neither of us seemed surprised. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to fade. Long shadows stretched across the street. For years I had protected Daniel from consequences, shielded him, defended him, excused him. Now the consequences were finally approaching. Not because I wanted revenge, because reality had finally caught up. And for the first time, I wasn't standing in front of it. I was stepping aside. As I turned back toward Robert's desk, one thought settled heavily into my mind. Daniel still believed the worst thing that happened that night was insulting his mother. He was wrong. The worst thing was that he had activated a chain of events he didn't even know existed. And very soon, a formal letter would arrive. A letter that would force him to discover exactly who truly controlled the empire he believed was his. Daniel Hayes had always believed bad news happened to other people. That was one of the privileges of success. When life rewards you often enough, you begin to think you're untouchable. 3 days after my meeting with Robert, that illusion finally cracked. I wasn't there when it happened. Robert told me later, and eventually Daniel himself filled in the rest. The official notice arrived at his Chicago mansion shortly before noon. A courier delivered it personally. Signature required. Confidential. Legal. The kind of envelope that instantly raises anxiety. Daniel was working from his home office when Vanessa brought it to him. At first, neither of them seemed particularly concerned. After all, wealthy people receive legal correspondence all the time. Contracts, investments, tax matters, business disputes. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what Daniel thought. Then he opened the envelope, and everything changed. According to Robert, Daniel called him less than 15 minutes later. The moment Robert saw the caller ID, he already knew why. He answered calmly. "Robert Whitman speaking." "What the hell is this?" Daniel's voice reportedly shook the walls. Robert remained calm. "I'm assuming you've read the notice." "I don't understand it." "I believe you do." "No, I don't." The anger in Daniel's voice was growing. A fiduciary review, suspension of authority, family stewardship investigation. Robert waited, then said quietly, "Those terms are explained in the documentation." "There has to be some mistake." "There isn't." Silence. Then Daniel asked the question Robert had expected. "Did my mother do this?" "Your mother initiated the review process." The silence that followed lasted several seconds, long enough for reality to begin settling in. Then came denial. "My mother can't do this." "Actually, she can." "No." Daniel's voice rose again. "No, she can't." Robert calmly opened a file. "Legally, she can." "That's impossible." "It isn't. Everything belongs to me." Robert later admitted that hearing those words saddened him, not because Daniel was wrong, because of how quickly he said them. Everything belongs to me, not our family, not our legacy, not what my parents built. Me. Robert answered carefully. "The documents indicate otherwise." The call ended shortly afterward. Not because Daniel accepted reality, because he refused to. Unfortunately, reality doesn't require acceptance, only existence. Later that evening, Daniel gathered every legal document he could find. Property records, trust agreements, partnership contracts, asset structures, years of paperwork. For nearly 6 hours, he reviewed them. Vanessa sat beside him. At first, she appeared supportive, but Robert told me something interesting. Every time Daniel looked confused, Vanessa looked nervous. Not angry, not surprised, nervous. As if she understood more than she wanted him to know. That detail would become important later. Very important. Around midnight, Daniel finally found the truth, or at least part of it. The mansion, the Aspen vacation home, several investment portfolios, the private equity holdings, the trust structures, everything connected, everything protected, everything conditional. For years, Daniel had viewed himself as owner. In reality, he had been something closer to steward, manager, beneficiary, but not absolute owner. And now that authority was under review. When the realization hit him, panic arrived. Real panic. Not frustration. Not irritation. Fear. Because for the first time in his adult life, Daniel discovered there was something he couldn't control. The next morning, he called me. 5 times. I didn't answer. Then 10 times. Still nothing. He left 3 voicemails. The first was angry. "Mom, call me immediately." The second was defensive. "There's obviously been some misunderstanding." The third sounded different, not softer, scared. "Please call me." I listened to all 3, then deleted them. Not because I hated my son, because I needed him to sit with his choices. For once, by the end of the week, the situation became even worse. The review process triggered temporary restrictions. Nothing catastrophic, nothing permanent, but enough to get Daniel's attention. Several major financial decisions now required oversight. Certain asset transfers paused automatically. A handful of pending transactions were flagged for examination. Everything legal. Everything according to documents Daniel had signed years earlier without fully reading. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel built a career helping wealthy people understand contracts. Yet, he'd never understood his own. That Friday afternoon, Robert called me. "Eleanor?" "How bad?" A brief pause. "He's frightened." I stared out my kitchen window. The tomatoes in my garden swayed gently in the summer breeze. For a moment, I felt guilty. Then I remembered the folding table, the missing chair, Sophie's tears. The guilt faded. "What exactly happened?" Robert sighed. He spent 2 days trying to prove the review was invalid. "And he failed." I nodded. That didn't surprise me. Richard had been meticulous. Once he committed to something, every detail was protected. "What about Vanessa?" The silence on the other end immediately caught my attention. "What?" Robert hesitated. "We've identified additional irregularities." A chill moved through me. "The transactions?" "Yes." "How serious?" "We're still determining that." His careful tone worried me. Robert only spoke that way when he was genuinely concerned. "Do they involve Daniel?" "Possibly." "Possibly." "We believe some transactions originated through accounts Vanessa controlled." I closed my eyes. There it was again. Vanessa. Always somewhere near the center of the smoke. Not enough evidence for conclusions, but enough for concern. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think about it. Trying and failing. Because despite everything, Daniel was still my son. And mothers never completely stop worrying, even when they should. That evening, Sophie called. The moment I heard her voice, my heart softened. "Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart." She sounded hesitant, small, almost afraid. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." A long pause followed. Then, "Are you mad at Dad? Children always find the question adults avoid." I sat down slowly. "What do you think?" Another pause. "I think you're hurt." My eyes filled with tears. 12 years old. And somehow she understood more than the adults. "You're right. He shouldn't have said those things." "No. He was wrong." I swallowed hard. "Yes." Then came the question that broke my heart. Can families get fixed? For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Because the truth was complicated. Families can heal. Sometimes. But healing requires honesty, responsibility, change. Things Daniel hadn't shown yet. Still, Sophie deserved hope. "Yes," I said softly. "Families can get fixed." "Really? Really?" The relief in her voice was immediate. "Good." After we hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, thinking, remembering, praying. Because beneath all the legal documents, trust structures, and financial reviews existed a simpler truth. This wasn't really about money. Never had been. It was about respect, gratitude, character. The things Richard cared about most. The things Daniel had forgotten. The things he would soon be forced to confront. My phone buzzed again. Another text. Daniel. This one was different. No demands. No accusations. Just one sentence. Mom, I need to see you. I stared at the message. Then at the fading evening sunlight outside my window. For the first time since the dinner party, I sensed something new. Not remorse. Not yet. But fear. Real fear. And sometimes fear is the first crack in arrogance. The first step toward humility. The first step toward change. Unfortunately for Daniel, another storm was already forming. Because while he was busy panicking over the family trust, Robert's investigation into Vanessa's financial activity was uncovering something much worse. Something neither of us fully understood yet. But whatever it was, it had the potential to destroy far more than a fortune. The first time Daniel came to see me after the dinner party, he didn't come as a son. He came as a man trying to stop a problem. There is a difference. A painful difference. It happened 4 days after he sent the message asking to meet. I was watering flowers in my front yard when I saw a black luxury SUV pull into my driveway. I knew immediately who it was. Only Daniel would drive a vehicle worth more than my entire house and still complain about expenses. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened. And there he was, my son. For a brief moment, my heart betrayed me. Because no matter how old your child becomes, part of you still sees the little boy. The little boy who once brought you dandelions and called them flowers. The little boy who needed you. Then I remembered the folding table, the missing chair, Sophie's tears, and reality returned. Daniel walked toward me. His expensive suit looked slightly wrinkled. His face looked tired. The confident businessman I'd seen at the mansion was gone. But what replaced him wasn't humility. Not yet. It was anxiety. Mom! I turned off the hose. Daniel! For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. He looked around my yard. The garden. The porch. The old swing Richard built years ago. Places he hadn't truly noticed in years. Finally, he cleared his throat. We need to talk. The same words from his text message. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just business. I nodded toward the porch. Sit down. We took seats across from one another. The summer afternoon felt strangely quiet. Birds chirped in the distance. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. Sounds that felt completely disconnected from the storm sitting between us. Daniel leaned forward first. I got the notice. I assumed you had. This is insane. There it was. Not remorse. Not regret. Anger. I remained silent. Daniel continued. You know what this could do. Yes. It could affect everything. I know. My company. I know. My reputation. I know. My investments. I know. Each answer seemed to frustrate him more. Because I wasn't arguing. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't reacting the way he expected. Finally, he threw his hands into the air. Then why are you doing this? I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time since the dinner party, I answered honestly. Because you did. His expression tightened. What does that mean? You started this. No. Yes. He shook his head. Mom, you're overreacting. The words hit harder than he realized. Not because they were cruel, because they were familiar. People often accuse others of overreacting when they don't want to confront what caused the reaction. I folded my hands in my lap. Am I? Yes. His confidence returned slightly. It was one dinner. I stared at him. One dinner. The phrase echoed inside my head. One dinner. As if the problem began that night. As if years of disrespect hadn't existed before it. As if humiliation was measured by duration. I took a slow breath, then asked quietly, Do you remember your first bicycle? Daniel blinked. The question clearly surprised him. What? Your first bicycle? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember it? He sighed. Yes. It was blue. So, you wanted it more than anything. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Mom. You were 8. I continued anyway. Your father and I couldn't afford it. His expression softened slightly. Despite himself, memories were beginning to surface. You remember that? Of course. I smiled sadly. I worked extra shifts for 3 months. Daniel looked away. I continued. You remember your college acceptance letter? He remained silent. You cried. A faint smile appeared, just briefly. I remember. You thought we had enough money. I paused. We didn't. His eyes slowly returned to mine. What are you talking about? Your tuition. A shadow crossed his face. I could see confusion beginning to replace anger. Mom, I sold my grandmother's jewelry. Silence. Complete silence. The kind that arrives when someone hears something they never expected. Daniel stared at me. You never told me that. No? Why not? Because I didn't do it for recognition. His jaw tightened. I continued. Do you remember your first business loan? Now his face had gone pale. Yes. You couldn't get approved? His eyes narrowed. How do you know? Because your father and I refinanced our house. The color drained from his face. What? I nodded. If your business failed, we could have lost everything. No. His voice sounded weak. That's impossible. It happened. Daniel sat back heavily. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely shaken. Not because of money, because his version of history was beginning to collapse. For years, he had viewed himself as self-made. Now cracks were appearing, and those cracks hurt. I continued quietly. Do you know what hurts most? He didn't answer. The dinner wasn't the problem. His eyes lifted. The problem was that you truly believed what you said. Silence. Mom, you believed I had nothing. My voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. You looked at your own mother and saw someone without value because she wasn't rich. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no defense, not an honest one. We sat in silence for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. I was angry. At me. No. Then who? He looked away. And suddenly, something interesting happened. The confident businessman disappeared. A tired man remained. Everything has been stressful. There it is. His eyes returned. What? The excuse. I'm not making excuses. Yes, you are. His frustration returned instantly. I'm trying to explain. No, I shook my head. You're trying to justify. The words landed harder than I intended. Daniel stood abruptly. You don't understand what I'm dealing with. I almost laughed. After everything I'd survived, after decades of sacrifice, after years of protecting him, now I didn't understand hardship. The irony was overwhelming. I stood as well. Then explain it. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because the truth wasn't complicated. The truth was that Daniel wanted sympathy without accountability. Understanding without responsibility. Forgiveness without repentance. And life doesn't work that way. Neither do relationships. Several seconds passed. Then I made a decision. One final attempt. One final opportunity. Daniel, he looked at me. If you truly want this fixed, there is a way. Hope appeared immediately in his eyes. What? The speed of that reaction told me everything. He wasn't thinking about our relationship. He was thinking about the review, the trust, the assets. Still, I continued. You publicly humiliated me. His expression tightened. You publicly embarrassed your family. I continued. You hurt Sophie. He looked away. You did all of it publicly? The silence stretched. Then I gave him the opportunity. The only one. Call a family gathering. His eyes narrowed. What? Invite everyone who was there. Why? You know why? The realization hit him instantly. No. I nodded. Yes. His face hardened. You want me to apologize in front of everybody? I want you to take responsibility in front of everybody. His disbelief quickly transformed into anger. Absolutely not. There it was. The answer. The real answer. Not fear. Not confusion. Pride. The same pride Richard feared. The same pride hidden beneath every excuse, every justification, every defense. I felt something inside me break, not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, like the final thread snapping. Because in that moment, I realized something. Daniel still wasn't sorry. He was scared. And those are not the same thing. I nodded once. Then we're finished. His eyes widened. What? This conversation. Mom. No. I stepped back. You had your chance. His anger flared. So that's it? No. I looked directly at him. This is simply the consequence. For several seconds, we stared at one another. Mother and son. Love and disappointment. Hope and pride. Then Daniel turned and walked toward his SUV. Halfway there, he stopped. For one brief moment, I thought he might come back. Thought he might finally say the words, "I'm sorry." Instead, he climbed into the vehicle and drove away. I stood in my driveway long after he disappeared, watching the empty road, feeling older than I had in years, because I finally understood something painful. The legal battle wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was accepting that my son still cared more about protecting his pride than saving our relationship. What I didn't know was that while Daniel drove back to Chicago, angry and defeated, Robert's investigation had uncovered a financial trail leading directly to Vanessa. And the truth waiting at the end of that trail was far worse than anyone imagined. If there is one lesson life teaches repeatedly, it's this. Sometimes the person destroying a family isn't the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the quiet voice whispering in someone's ear. For years, I believed Daniel's transformation happened entirely on its own. Success changed him. Money changed him. Power changed him. That was the explanation I accepted because it was easier. The truth, however, was more complicated and much more dangerous. A week after Daniel visited my house, Robert called again. I could tell immediately from his voice that something significant had happened. "Eleanor, what is it? We need to talk." My stomach tightened. Those 4 words rarely bring good news. "How serious?" A pause. Then, I sat down at my kitchen table. The same table where Richard and I had shared countless meals. The same table where Daniel once did homework. The same table where our family used to feel whole. "What did you find?" Robert exhaled slowly. "We've completed a preliminary review of the transactions." I gripped the phone tighter. "And the pattern is becoming clearer." A chill ran through me. "What pattern?" "Vanessa." The name landed heavily. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. Somewhere deep inside, I'd suspected it for years. Not that she was responsible for everything, but that she amplified the worst parts of Daniel, encouraged them, rewarded them, fed them. Robert continued. "Several asset movements originated through entities connected to Vanessa. Illegal? Possibly?" My pulse quickened. "What exactly are we talking about? Large transfers. How large? Millions?" I closed my eyes. Millions. Even hearing the number felt surreal. Daniel authorized them. We're not certain. The uncertainty bothered me more than certainty would have, because uncertainty meant hidden truths, and hidden truths tend to explode eventually. After ending the call, I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on ordinary things. Laundry, groceries, gardening. None of it worked. My thoughts kept returning to Vanessa. I remembered the first time Daniel introduced her. She was beautiful, smart, ambitious, confident. Richard liked her immediately. So did I. At least initially. But over time, subtle things emerged. Little comments. Small observations. Tiny moments most people would ignore. I remembered one Christmas dinner years earlier. Daniel had bought me a handmade quilt from a local artisan. I loved it. Vanessa looked confused. "That's what you got your mother." Daniel smiled. "She'll love it." Vanessa laughed softly. "You could have bought something much nicer." At the time, it seemed harmless. Now I wasn't so sure, because Vanessa always measured value through money, price tags, status, appearances. Everything had a dollar amount attached to it. Everything. Even relationships. Especially relationships. Looking back, I realized something uncomfortable. Daniel's obsession with status intensified after their marriage. Not immediately. Gradually. Like water wearing away stone. Year after year. Conversation after conversation. Influence after influence. Until eventually he became someone Richard barely recognized. And maybe Daniel wasn't the only one responsible. Maybe he wasn't even the primary target. Maybe he was simply the person being shaped. That possibility frightened me. 3 days later, Robert called again. This time, the news was worse. Much worse. "Eleanor, what happened?" "We uncovered debt." I frowned. "Daniel's debt?" "No." A pause. "Vanessa's." The room suddenly felt colder. "How much?" Robert was silent for several seconds. Then, "More than $6 million?" I nearly dropped the phone. "What?" The number seemed impossible. Absurd. Unreal. But Robert wasn't a man who exaggerated. "How?" "Luxury spending." I stared at the wall, unable to process it. $6 million. At least. At least. The words were somehow worse, because they suggested the real figure might be higher. Much higher. "What kind of spending?" Robert sounded exhausted. "Jewelry. Cars. Private memberships. Investment speculation. Designer purchases. Personal accounts." Every sentence made me feel sicker. Not because of the money, because of the recklessness. Because while Daniel was humiliating his mother for appearing poor, his own household was drowning in hidden debt. The irony was painful, almost unbearable. What does Daniel know? We're still trying to determine that. Again, the same uncertainty, the same dangerous gray area. That evening, I received my answer. Unexpectedly. Through Sophie. My granddaughter called after school. We talked about ordinary things at first. Her classes, friends, summer plans. Then her voice changed. Became quieter. "Grandma." "Yes." "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." A long silence followed. Then, "My parents fight a lot now." My heart sank. Children always suffer first, even when adults pretend otherwise. "What kind of fighting?" "I don't know." Her voice sounded small. "Mostly money." I closed my eyes. "Money. Of course." "They think I can't hear." Another pause. "But I can?" I swallowed hard. Sweetheart, Dad keeps asking Mom questions. Questions. The investigation, the transactions. The pieces were starting to connect. What kind of questions? I don't know. She hesitated. Something about accounts. Accounts. There it was. Confirmation. Daniel knew something was wrong. At least now he did. The conversation stayed with me all evening. Because beneath the legal complications and financial records existed a little girl caught in the middle. A little girl who loved both parents, a little girl who loved her grandmother. A little girl who didn't deserve any of this. That night, I found myself standing in front of an old photograph. Richard. Me. Daniel at age 10. The three of us smiling beside a camping tent. Back before success. Back before wealth. Back before status became more important than character. I touched the frame gently. You were right. The words escaped before I realized I was speaking. Richard had seen it. Years ago. Long before any of us. Not Vanessa specifically, but the danger, the vulnerability, the pride, the hunger for approval, the need to appear successful. And now the consequences were unfolding exactly as he feared. The next morning, Robert called once more. His voice sounded different, more serious than ever. What now? We found something. My stomach dropped. What? A property agreement. I frowned. What kind of property agreement? The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Too many seconds. Then Robert answered. Vanessa has been preparing exit strategies. The words took a moment to register. Exit strategies. Yes. I sat down slowly. What does that mean? It means she anticipated financial trouble. A cold feeling spread through my chest. And Robert lowered his voice. She was preparing to sell assets. My pulse quickened. Without Daniel. We believe so. For a moment, I couldn't speak, because suddenly everything made sense. The debt, the hidden transfers, the anxiety, the manipulation, the constant pressure for more money, more status, more appearances. Vanessa wasn't protecting the family. She was protecting herself. And if Robert was right, she'd been preparing an escape plan while Daniel remained completely unaware. The realization left me speechless. Not because it was shocking, because it was tragic. Daniel had spent years choosing status over family, appearance over substance, and now the very world he chose was beginning to betray him, just as he betrayed those who loved him most. I hung up the phone and stared out my kitchen window. The afternoon sun stretched across the backyard. Everything looked peaceful, normal. Yet I knew a storm was coming. A massive one. Because Daniel still hadn't seen all the evidence. He still didn't know the full truth about Vanessa. And when he finally did, it wouldn't just threaten his finances. It would destroy the foundation of the life he believed he had built. The family meeting took place on a rainy Thursday afternoon. If someone had told me a year earlier that my family would gather in a law office instead of around a dinner table, I never would have believed them. Yet there I was, sitting in a large conference room at Robert Whitman's firm, waiting. Outside, rain streaked across the windows. Inside, tension filled every corner. No one wanted to be there, especially Daniel, especially Vanessa. Robert had insisted on the meeting after completing enough of the investigation to present his findings. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to force the truth into the open. The room was deliberately neutral. Long conference table, leather chairs, bottled water, legal folders. No luxury, no status, no distractions, just facts. And sometimes, facts are the most dangerous things in the world. I arrived first. Old habit. Richard used to say punctuality was a form of respect. A few minutes later, Daniel entered. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Wrinkled shirt. Unshaven jaw. The polished executive image was beginning to crack. He glanced at me. I nodded politely. He nodded back. Neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa arrived. Unlike Daniel, she looked perfectly composed. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect designer outfit, the image of confidence. But I noticed something interesting. Her eyes. They moved constantly. Toward the folders, toward Robert's office, toward the door. People only do that when they're looking for exits. Robert entered last, carrying several thick binders. The room immediately grew quieter. He took his seat, folded his hands, and looked at everyone. "Thank you for coming." Nobody responded. Not surprising. Robert continued. "This meeting concerns matters involving the Hayes family trust." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa remained motionless. "As well as recent financial activity." There it was. The phrase that changed the atmosphere instantly. Financial activity, not legal review, not trust administration. Financial activity. Much more personal, much more dangerous. Robert opened the first binder. For several moments, he reviewed documents silently. Then he began. "Before we discuss recent findings, it's important to establish context." He looked toward Daniel. "Your father anticipated circumstances in which family assets might require protection." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I've heard this speech already." Robert ignored the interruption. "The trust structure was designed to preserve family wealth and family values simultaneously." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Family values." The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially me. Robert continued anyway. "The stewardship review was triggered following concerns regarding conduct inconsistent with those standards." Nobody needed clarification. Everybody knew what event started it. The dinner, the humiliation, the folding table, the moment everything changed. For the first time, I saw genuine embarrassment cross Daniel's face. Good. Embarrassment meant awareness. Awareness meant possibility. Then Robert shifted topics. "Now we move to the financial review." Vanessa straightened slightly. Just slightly. But enough. I noticed. Robert projected several documents onto a screen. Transaction records, bank statements, transfer histories. At first, they looked ordinary, complicated, technical, boring. Then patterns began emerging. Repeated transfers, connected entities, layered transactions. Hidden ownership structures? The kind of information that makes ordinary people uncomfortable. The kind lawyers notice immediately. Daniel leaned forward. What am I looking at? Robert pointed toward a highlighted section, a series of transactions conducted over the last 24 months. Daniel frowned. So they were not properly disclosed. Silence. Then, what? Robert displayed another page, and another, and another. The room grew quieter with each one. Finally, Daniel turned toward Vanessa. Did you know about this? Vanessa answered immediately. Of course not. Too quickly, far too quickly. Even Daniel seemed to notice. Robert remained calm. We traced multiple transfers through entities connected to Mrs. Hayes. Vanessa's expression hardened. Connected doesn't mean controlled. Correct. Then you're making assumptions. No. Robert slid another document across the table. We're making observations. Vanessa didn't touch it. That alone spoke volumes. Innocent people usually want to see evidence. Guilty people often already know what's there. Daniel picked up the document instead. His eyes scanned the page. Then another. Then another. Slowly, confusion replaced anger. What is this? Robert answered. Corporate ownership records. The color drained from Daniel's face. I watched it happen in real time. A man discovering pieces of his life he never knew existed. A shell company. His voice sounded distant, almost disbelieving. Robert nodded. Several. Daniel turned toward Vanessa. What is he talking about? For the first time all afternoon. Vanessa looked genuinely uncomfortable. Daniel, what is he talking about? His voice rose. She looked away, and that single movement told everyone in the room more than words ever could. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Robert opened another binder. This one was thinner, more focused, more dangerous. Eleanor. I looked up. Yes. I believe this document belongs to you. He handed me a file. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies of old trust records. Nothing surprising. Until I reached the final page. Then my breath caught. A signature. My signature. Except it wasn't. At least not entirely. I stared at it. Looked again. Then again. The room seemed to narrow. Robert's voice remained steady. We submitted it for forensic review. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Robert looked directly at him. It means the signature appears to have been forged. The room exploded. What? Daniel shot to his feet. His chair scraped violently across the floor. Forged. I could barely speak. My hands trembled because I knew immediately what that meant. Someone had attempted to access protected family assets, using my authority, without my permission, without my knowledge, without my consent. Daniel looked at me, then at Robert, then at Vanessa. His face had gone completely white. No. Vanessa finally stood. This is ridiculous. Her voice sounded sharp, defensive, panicked. The analysis is preliminary. Robert remained calm. Correct. So you don't know anything? We know enough. The room fell silent again. Then Daniel asked the question nobody wanted to hear. Vanessa. She froze. His voice was barely above a whisper. Did you do this? For several seconds, she said nothing. No denial, no outrage, no immediate response. Just silence. And silence can be very revealing, especially when innocence would answer instantly. Daniel looked like someone watching a building collapse. Slowly, piece by piece. The foundation of his marriage was beginning to crack, and he knew it. Finally, Vanessa spoke. You're seriously believing this? Not yes, not no, just deflection. Daniel noticed. So did everyone else. The room grew heavier, darker, more painful, because the truth was no longer hiding. Not completely. Not anymore. Robert closed the binder. We are continuing our investigation. Nobody spoke. There will be additional findings. Still silence. And there may be legal consequences. That sentence landed hardest. Legal consequences. Not family consequences. Not trust consequences. Legal consequences. Real ones. Serious ones. Daniel sank back into his chair. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something unexpected. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of losing property. Fear of realizing he no longer understood the people closest to him. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No dramatic shouting. No final confession. No resolution. Just silence. Heavy silence. The kind that follows life-changing information. As everyone gathered their things, Daniel remained seated, motionless. Vanessa left first. Without looking at anyone, without saying goodbye, without touching her husband. That detail stayed with me, because married people facing hardship usually move closer together. Vanessa moved away, and Daniel noticed. I could see it in his eyes. As I prepared to leave, Robert quietly approached me. There's more. Of course there was. There always is. How much more? His expression darkened. Enough. A chill moved through me. What did you find? Robert lowered his voice. The forged signature wasn't the worst part. My stomach dropped. What is... He looked toward the conference room door Vanessa had just exited through, then answered. We finally know where some of the missing money went. The words hit like ice water, because suddenly I understood. The storm wasn't approaching anymore. It had arrived, and whatever Robert discovered next was powerful enough to make even him look worried after the family meeting. Daniel's life began falling apart in ways money couldn't fix. From the outside, everything still looked impressive. The mansion still stood. The luxury cars remained in the driveway. The investment company still occupied a prestigious office tower in downtown Chicago. The photographs on social media still displayed success, but appearances are often the last thing to collapse. The real damage happens underneath. Invisible at first, then all at once. 3 days after the meeting, Daniel called me. I didn't answer. Not because I hated him, because I knew he still wasn't ready for the conversation that mattered. The next day, he called again and again. Eventually, I listened to one of the voicemails. His voice sounded different. Tired. Not angry, just tired. Mom, please call me back. Nothing more. No excuses. No demands. Just a request. For the first time, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of understanding. Meanwhile, Robert's investigation continued, and every new discovery created additional pressure. The financial concerns surrounding Vanessa were becoming impossible to ignore. Several asset transfers had now been traced. Multiple accounts had been identified. The numbers were staggering. But what truly shocked Daniel wasn't the money. It was the secrecy. For years, he believed he controlled every detail of his financial empire. Now he was discovering entire sections of his life existed beyond his awareness. That realization wounded his pride more deeply than any financial loss ever could. One afternoon, Robert called to update me. "How is he handling it?" I asked. Robert laughed softly. "Not well?" I wasn't surprised. "What happened?" "He fired 3 advisors." I blinked. "What?" "He blamed them." Of course he did. For years, Daniel solved problems by finding someone else responsible. That strategy works until reality refuses to cooperate. And now, Robert sighed. Now he's running out of people to blame. That answer stayed with me, because sometimes growth begins exactly there, when blame finally reaches its limit. A week later, Daniel experienced another painful lesson. Several people he considered close friends stopped calling. At first, he assumed they were busy. Then he noticed something. The invitations disappeared. The networking dinners disappeared. The charity galas disappeared. The golf outings disappeared. People who once competed for his attention suddenly became unavailable. One investor postponed a meeting. Another stopped returning messages. A third informed him that future opportunities would be reconsidered. Business language for goodbye. Daniel had spent years believing those relationships were built on friendship. Now he was learning they were built on usefulness. The distinction hurt. A lot. I learned most of this from Robert, some from mutual acquaintances, and eventually some from Daniel himself, because slowly, almost reluctantly, he began talking, really talking, not performing, not selling, not persuading, talking. One evening, he finally reached me. I answered. The silence on the line lasted several seconds. "Mom." "Hello?" "Daniel." The relief in his voice was immediate, as though he wasn't sure I'd ever answer again. "Thank you." "For what?" "For picking up." My heart softened despite myself, because that sounded less like a businessman and more like a son. We spoke cautiously at first. Weather, health, Sophie, safe topics. Then eventually, he said it. "Things are bad." The admission surprised me. Daniel rarely admitted weakness. "How bad?" A long pause followed. Finally, "I don't know who I can trust." There it was, the real problem. Not money, not assets, trust. the thing he'd neglected for years, the thing he suddenly needed. I stared out my kitchen window. The evening sun painted golden light across the yard. When did you start noticing what? That something was wrong? He exhaled slowly. I don't know. Try. Several seconds passed. Then, maybe a year ago. That answer surprised me. A year, much longer than I expected. What happened? I kept finding things that didn't make sense. Accounts, expenses, transfers, questions, small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic individually, but together they formed a pattern he ignored. Because facing it would have required confronting uncomfortable truths. I understood. People do that all the time, especially when the truth threatens something they value, or someone. Why didn't you investigate? His answer came quietly. Because I didn't want to know. The honesty stunned me. For the first time in years, Daniel sounded genuine, painfully genuine. And genuine people often tell uncomfortable truths. I thought if I worked harder, everything would be fine. I closed my eyes. There he was, the little boy again. The child who believed effort could solve everything. The child who hadn't yet learned that some problems grow while we're looking away. We talked for nearly 30 minutes. Not once did he mention the trust, the assets, the review. Instead, he talked about confusion, fear, failure, emotions he'd spent years avoiding. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking, because something important had happened. For the first time since the dinner party, Daniel had spoken like a human being instead of a successful man. And that mattered, more than he realized. Unfortunately, life wasn't finished teaching him lessons. A few days later, Vanessa moved out. Temporarily. She claimed, just to have space. The phrase almost made me laugh. People rarely need space when things are going well. They need space when they're preparing exits. She moved into a luxury condominium downtown. Daniel told Sophie it wasn't permanent. Neither of them believed it. Especially Sophie. The child saw more than anyone realized. She called me that weekend. Grandma. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded sad. My parents are separating. I closed my eyes. There it was. The sentence every child fears. I'm sorry. So am I. A pause followed. Then she asked, did Dad do something bad? Children always search for simple answers. Life rarely provides them. Your father made mistakes. Mom, too. I hesitated, then answered honestly. Yes. Another pause. Are they bad people? The question broke my heart, because children often assume mistakes define identity. I chose my words carefully. No. Then what are they? I looked toward the photograph of Richard sitting on my mantel, then answered. People who made bad choices. The distinction mattered. At least to me. Maybe because I desperately wanted it to remain true. That evening, Daniel called again. This time, he sounded defeated. Not angry. Not frightened. Defeated. Vanessa left. I wasn't surprised. Still, hearing it hurt. Because regardless of everything, This was still my family. Still my granddaughter's family. I'm sorry. His laugh sounded hollow. I think she was planning it. The statement didn't shock me. Neither did the sadness behind it. When did you realize? At the meeting. I understood immediately. The silence. The deflection. The lack of denial. Sometimes betrayal becomes visible all at once. A single moment. A single look. A single realization. And after that, you can never unsee it. We talked briefly. Then he said something unexpected. Something that stayed with me long after the call ended. I keep thinking about that night. The dinner. Of course. What about it? His voice cracked slightly. I keep seeing Sophie's face. Not my humiliation. Not the trust review. Not the financial losses. Sophie's tears. For the first time, he was remembering the right thing, and that gave me hope. Just a little. Not enough to erase the damage. Not enough to restore trust. But enough to suggest something important. Daniel Hayes was finally beginning to suffer the consequences Richard always feared. And in that suffering, something new was emerging. Humility. The question was whether it had arrived too late. Because while Daniel struggled to rebuild his life, Robert had just completed another stage of the investigation, and what he discovered would force a final decision about the future of the Hayes family legacy. The final stage of Robert's investigation arrived 2 weeks later, and with it came the truth. The whole truth. The kind that changes families forever. I was sitting on my back porch when Robert called. The evening sun was setting behind the trees. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass. For a few peaceful seconds, I almost ignored the phone. Almost. Then I saw Robert's name. I answered immediately. Eleanor. His voice sounded unusually heavy. My stomach tightened. What happened? A pause. Then, we finished. I closed my eyes. Finished. One simple word, yet I knew it carried enormous weight. And Robert exhaled slowly. We know where the money went. The sentence landed like a stone in my chest. For months now, everything had pointed toward this moment. Every transfer, every suspicious account, every unexplained transaction. Now there would finally be answers. Tell me. Silence. Then Robert spoke carefully. Vanessa wasn't preparing for financial security. What was she preparing for? Another pause. Departure. The word hurt more than I expected, not because it surprised me, because it confirmed what I'd been fearing. How long? Nearly 3 years. 3 years. I stared into the distance. 3 years. While attending family gatherings, while smiling in photographs, while building a public image of success, she had quietly been preparing an escape plan. Daniel knows. He does now. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted. How bad is it? Robert didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost sympathetic. Bad enough. I understood. Sometimes numbers stop mattering. Sometimes betrayal becomes the larger story. And this was one of those times. The next morning, Daniel called. For a long moment, I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded broken. Not damaged. Broken. Mom. I immediately knew. He'd learned everything. I'm here. Silence. Then I heard him exhale shakily. She was leaving. The sentence barely emerged. Like he still couldn't believe it. Robert explained. I didn't see it. No anger. No defensiveness. Just pain. Raw pain. I remained quiet. Sometimes people need space to continue. Daniel did. I thought we were building something together. Another pause. I thought we wanted the same things. My eyes drifted toward the photograph of Richard on my bookshelf. How many times had he tried warning us? How many times had we ignored him? Sometimes people want the same destination, I said softly, but for different reasons. Daniel laughed bitterly. I guess so. Then his voice lowered. She never cared about any of it. The houses, the cars, the business, the image. It was all just leverage. The realization sounded devastating because for the first time, Daniel was seeing his life through a different lens. Not as success, as vulnerability. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, longer than any conversation we'd had in years. And something unusual happened. Daniel talked very little about money. Instead, he talked about regret, the business dinners he skipped family events for, the holidays he cut short, the years he spent chasing approval from strangers, the relationships he neglected, the daughter who grew up while he worked, the mother he humiliated. One realization seemed to haunt him more than any other. They all disappeared. I knew exactly who he meant. The investors, the social circle, the status-driven friends, the people who surrounded him when everything looked perfect. Most of them stopped calling. I wasn't surprised. Real relationships survive hardship. Transactional relationships don't, Daniel continued. I thought they cared. They cared, I said. About something. The silence that followed told me he understood. A few days later, something happened that surprised everyone. Daniel sold the mansion, not because he was forced to, because he wanted to. The decision shocked the business community. The mansion had become part of his identity, his symbol, his statement, his proof. Yet suddenly, it was on the market. When Robert told me, I assumed there had to be another reason. There isn't. What do you mean? Robert laughed softly. He said he's tired of living inside a performance. The sentence stayed with me, because that was exactly what his life had become. A performance, a carefully constructed image, an endless attempt to prove something. The mansion sold quickly, very quickly. Daniel moved into a much smaller home closer to Sophie's school. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed for impressing investors. Just a house, the kind ordinary families live in, the kind Richard and I always preferred. Sophie loved it immediately, at least according to Daniel, for the first time in years. She had her father around regularly. No staff, no events, no endless networking dinners. Just time. actual time, months earlier, Daniel would have considered that a downgrade. Now he called it a blessing. People change in strange ways, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes through suffering. Daniel's change seemed to be arriving through both. Then one afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Sophie. Daniel had driven her to Ohio. When I opened the front door, she launched herself into my arms. I nearly lost my balance. "Grandma," I laughed through tears. "There's my girl." For the next several hours, we baked cookies, worked in the garden, talked about school, talked about life, normal things, beautiful things. The kinds of moments families often overlook. As evening approached, Sophie finally asked the question she'd been carrying for months. "Are you going to forgive Dad?" I looked toward the kitchen window. Outside, Daniel sat quietly on the porch swing Richard built years ago. Waiting. Not pushing. Just waiting. The sight affected me more than I expected, because old Daniel never waited. He demanded, controlled, directed. This version simply sat there. Patiently, I turned back towards Sophie. "Why do you ask?" She smiled sadly. "Because he's different now." Children notice change before adults do. Perhaps because they aren't distracted by pride. I considered her words carefully, then nodded. Yes. Relief flooded her face instantly. Not excitement. Relief. The kind only children understand. The relief that comes when people you love stop moving further apart. Later that evening, after Sophie went inside, Daniel and I sat alone on the porch, the same porch where Richard and I spent countless evenings, the same porch where Daniel once played as a child. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "I read Dad's letter." My heart stopped. The letter, the one I'd found months earlier, the one Robert eventually gave him. "What did you think?" His eyes remained fixed on the yard. He knew. Yes. He saw everything. Almost. Daniel swallowed hard. I wish I had listened. The sadness in his voice felt genuine. Painfully genuine. For the first time in years, there was no performance. No image. No audience. Just a son confronting the man he became. And the father he disappointed. The sun slowly disappeared below the horizon. Darkness settled around us. Then Daniel said something I'll never forget. Something Richard would have loved hearing. "I spent my entire life trying to become successful." He paused. A long pause. Then, and somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to become good. The honesty nearly brought me to tears, because that was the real tragedy. Not the money, not the trust, not the mansion. Character. That was always the issue. Character. And finally, after all this time, Daniel understood. What neither of us knew that evening was that one final decision remained. A decision that would determine not only Daniel's future, but the future of the entire Hayes family legacy. The hardest thing Daniel Hayes ever did wasn't building a company. It wasn't making millions of dollars. It wasn't surviving the collapse of his marriage. The hardest thing he ever did was learning how to be someone's son again. And unlike business, there was no shortcut, no strategy, no negotiation, no contract, only time and humility. The months that followed became the most transformative period of Daniel's life. Not because he regained anything, because he lost almost everything he once believed mattered. The mansion was gone. The luxury lifestyle was gone. Many of the people he once called friends had vanished. The illusion had shattered. What remained was reality. And reality is often where healing begins. I noticed the changes slowly. At first, they were small, almost invisible. A phone call asking about my health. A text message wishing me a good morning. A photograph of Sophie after a school event. Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed to impress. Just consistency. For years, Daniel had made grand gestures. Now he was learning the value of small ones. One Saturday morning, I opened my front door and nearly laughed. Daniel stood on the porch holding a toolbox. "What happened?" He looked embarrassed. "The fence?" I blinked. "What fence?" "The one behind your garden." I turned around. Sure enough, one section leaned slightly to one side. I'd noticed it weeks earlier. I simply hadn't done anything about it. "You drove 3 hours for a fence." He shrugged. "It needed fixing." I stared at him suspiciously. The old Daniel would have hired someone. The old Daniel would have sent money. The old Daniel would have offered advice. This Daniel brought a toolbox. The difference mattered. For the next several hours, we worked side by side, not discussing legal matters, not discussing Vanessa, not discussing money, just fixing a fence. Occasionally we talked. Mostly we worked, and for the first time in years, being around my son felt familiar, not comfortable, not healed, but familiar. At lunch, we sat on the porch, eating sandwiches. Daniel looked toward the backyard. "You know something?" "What?" "I don't remember the last time I did physical work." I smiled. "That's obvious." He laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd heard in a very long time. Then his expression softened. "Dad would have enjoyed this." My throat tightened. "Yes, he always liked fixing things." I nodded. He believed most things deserved a repair attempt before replacement. Daniel stared into the yard. I think he was talking about more than fences. I didn't answer, because he was right, and we both knew it. As summer turned into autumn, the changes continued. Daniel became involved in Sophie's life in ways he'd never been before. School concerts, parent meetings, soccer games, science fairs, ordinary moments, the moments he'd once missed. Sophie noticed immediately. Children always do. One afternoon, she called me. "Grandma." "Hello, sweetheart." Dad came to my presentation. I smiled. "That's wonderful." "He was early." The excitement in her voice nearly broke my heart. Because children shouldn't be surprised when their parents show up. Yet she was. And that realization said everything. He even stayed afterward. I closed my eyes, listening, smiling, healing, little by little. The next major change happened during Thanksgiving. For years, Daniel hosted extravagant holiday gatherings. Caterers, valet parking, designer decorations, everything polished, everything expensive. This year was different. He invited only family, no investors, no business partners, no networking opportunities, just family. And he asked if I would come. The invitation itself felt significant because there was no pressure, no expectation, just a request. I accepted. The dinner was held at his smaller home. The moment I arrived, I noticed the difference. The house felt lived in, warm, comfortable, human. Not a showroom, not a performance, a home. Sophie greeted me at the door. Daniel followed shortly after. For a second, I found myself remembering another Thanksgiving decades earlier. A much younger Daniel, a much younger Richard, a much simpler life. The memory lingered, painful, beautiful. Both. Dinner itself was surprisingly quiet. No speeches, no bragging, no discussions about investments, just conversation, actual conversation, the kind families are supposed to have. At one point, Sophie disappeared upstairs, leaving Daniel and me alone in the kitchen. For several moments, we worked silently, washing dishes, drying plates, ordinary tasks. Then Daniel spoke. "Mom!" The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. "Yes." He placed a plate on the counter, then another, buying time, gathering courage. Finally, he turned toward me. "I owe you an apology." My heart immediately accelerated, not because I'd been waiting for it, because I wasn't sure it would ever come. Daniel continued. "I know I've said things before." He swallowed hard. "But not the way I should have." I remained silent, letting him continue. His eyes drifted toward the sink. "I spent years believing success made me important." A pause. "Then I started believing it made me better." Another pause. "Then I started believing it made me right." The honesty surprised me. Not because it was inaccurate, because it was precise, painfully precise. "I look down on people." His voice lowered. "I look down on you." The words hurt. Even now. Perhaps they always would. But hearing him acknowledge them mattered. A lot. I told myself I earned everything. He shook his head. "I didn't." I thought about the jewelry, the second jobs, the refinanced house, the years of sacrifice. "No." His eyes filled slightly. "No." The silence stretched between us. Then he said the words I'd been waiting months to hear. Not because I demanded them, because they needed to come from him. "I, Emory." No qualifications. No excuses. No explanations. Just responsibility. The kind Richard spent his life trying to teach. The kind Daniel spent years avoiding. The kind that finally arrived. I felt tears gathering. But I kept my composure, not because I wasn't emotional, because this moment belonged to him. His growth, his choice, his accountability. I know sorry doesn't fix it. His voice cracked slightly. I know I can't erase what happened. I nodded. You're right. The truth hurt. But truth matters, especially in healing. He looked down, then nodded. I figured. For a brief moment, he looked like the little boy who expected punishment after breaking something. The little boy who knew he was wrong. The little boy who hoped he wasn't beyond forgiveness. And suddenly, I saw him. Really saw him. Not the businessman. Not the man who humiliated me. Not the husband who lost his marriage. My son. Flawed. Broken. Trying. And trying matters. More than pride. More than perfection. More than appearances. I touched his arm gently. The same way I used to when he was small. The same way mothers do when words aren't enough. He looked up, and for the first time in many months, I saw peace beginning to replace guilt. Not complete peace. Not yet. But the beginning. The possibility. The path. Later that evening, after I returned home, I sat on my porch watching the stars, thinking, remembering, praying. Richard used to say that true character isn't revealed when life rewards you. It's revealed when life humbles you. Daniel had finally been humbled. The question now wasn't whether he understood his mistakes. He did. The question was whether our family could become something stronger because of them. And soon, that question would finally be answered. Because Christmas was approaching, and with it would come a dinner unlike any other. A dinner that would determine whether healing had truly begun. Christmas arrived wrapped in snow. The kind of snow that transforms ordinary neighborhoods into postcards. The kind Richard loved. Every year, he would stand by the front window like a child and announce the first snowfall as if it were breaking news. I missed that. I missed him. And as Christmas morning approached, I found myself thinking about him more than usual. Perhaps because this was the first holiday in years that felt different. Honest. Fragile. Hopeful. For the first time in a long time, our family wasn't pretending. There were no masks left, no performances, no illusions, only truth. And strangely enough, truth had brought us closer than comfort ever did. Daniel insisted on hosting Christmas dinner. Not at a luxury venue, not at a private club. At home. His actual home. The smaller house. The one Sophie loved. The one that looked like a family lived there. When I arrived that afternoon, snowflakes drifted gently from the sky. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Warm lights glowed through windows. Children built snowmen. Families carried gifts. Ordinary life. Beautiful life. The kind Daniel once overlooked. The front door opened before I could knock. Sophie rushed outside. "Grandma!" I laughed as she nearly tackled me into the snow. "Merry Christmas." Sweetheart, Merry Christmas. Her happiness felt genuine, unforced. The kind children experience when the people they love are finally in the same room again. Daniel appeared behind her. He smiled softly. Not the polished smile he used to wear at business events. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. Merry Christmas, Mom! Merry Christmas. For a brief moment, we stood there awkwardly. Neither of us entirely sure how to navigate the new version of our relationship. Then Sophie solved the problem. As usual. She grabbed both our hands and dragged us inside. Come on. Children have a remarkable ability to ignore emotional complexity. Sometimes that's a gift. The house smelled incredible. Turkey, ham, fresh bread, cinnamon. Every room carried signs of preparation, signs of effort, signs of care. And unlike the mansion, nothing felt staged. A handmade ornament hung crookedly on the tree. Several decorations clearly belonged to Sophie. The table wasn't perfect. Neither was the house. That was precisely why it felt perfect. As dinner approached, more family members arrived. My sister, several cousins, aunts, uncles, people who mattered, people who remained when everything else disappeared. The people Daniel once pushed aside while chasing more influential company. Now they filled his living room, laughing, talking, living. I watched him carefully, observing, measuring. Old habits die hard. What I saw surprised me. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions, remembered details, paid attention. Small things, important things. The version of Daniel sitting in that living room would have been unrecognizable to the man who humiliated me months earlier. Not perfect, just different, better. As dinner time approached, everyone moved toward the dining room. And then something happened. Something simple. Something devastating. Something beautiful. Daniel pulled out a chair. For me, the seat at the head of the table. Not because of status, not because of wealth, because I belonged there. The room grew quiet. Not dramatically, just enough. Everyone remembered. The mansion, the folding table, the humiliation, the chair that wasn't there. Now this chair stood waiting. My eyes immediately filled with tears. Daniel noticed. His expression tightened. Not with embarrassment, with emotion. Mom. His voice sounded unsteady. I looked at him, and for several seconds, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to, because sometimes actions say what words cannot. I sat down, slowly, carefully. The chair felt ordinary, yet somehow it meant everything. Dinner began. Conversation flowed. Laughter returned. Stories emerged. Old memories resurfaced. For the first time in years, our family felt like a family. Not a collection of successful people. Not a network. A family. Halfway through the meal, Sophie stood unexpectedly. Everyone looked at her. She looked nervous. Very nervous. In her hands, she held a folded piece of paper. I wrote something. Instantly, the room became silent. Daniel looked confused. So did I. The entire table turned toward him. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded letter. My heart immediately accelerated because I knew exactly what was happening. Daniel stood. The room remained silent. Even Sophie sat down again, watching, waiting. My son looked around the table, then directly at me. His hands trembled slightly. I need to say something. No one interrupted. No one moved. For years, Daniel commanded rooms effortlessly. Yet now he looked more nervous than I'd ever seen him. Because this wasn't business. This was truth. And truth is much harder. He unfolded the paper, then began reading. When Dad died, I thought I understood what he left behind. His voice wavered. I was wrong. The room remained completely silent. I thought he left money. A business? Investments? Assets? He swallowed hard. What he actually left behind was responsibility. My throat tightened. Daniel continued. And I failed it. No excuses, no qualifications, no blame, just responsibility. The room felt frozen. I hurt people. He looked around the table. People who loved me. His eyes finally settled on me. I hurt my mother. The silence became almost unbearable. I embarrassed her. I disrespected her. I forgot everything she sacrificed. His voice cracked. For several seconds, he couldn't continue. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Finally, he took a breath, then continued. I spent years believing success made me valuable. A tear rolled down his cheek. I was wrong. His eyes remained locked on mine. My mother was valuable before I earned my first dollar. The room blurred through my tears. She was valuable when she worked 3 jobs. When she sold family heirlooms. When she sacrificed for me. When nobody was watching. Every word landed directly in my heart. Because none of this was easy for him. Pride never surrenders willingly. It has to be broken. And his had been. Finally. I cannot undo what I did. His voice lowered. But I can tell the truth. He folded the paper, then looked directly at me. I'm sorry. The room remained silent, waiting, watching, breathing. And in that moment, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't happen because someone deserves it. Forgiveness happens because healing deserves a chance. I stood slowly. My legs felt weak. My heart felt full. And before I could second-guess myself, I walked around the table, straight toward my son. For one brief second, uncertainty crossed his face. Then I wrapped my arms around him. The room immediately dissolved into tears. Mine, his, several other family members. Years of pain. Years of disappointment. Years of distance. Finally releasing. Not disappearing. Healing. There is a difference. As I held my son, I thought about Richard. about everything he tried to teach us, about everything Daniel finally learned, about everything our family nearly lost. And somehow, despite all of it, we were still standing, broken in places, scarred in places, but together, that night, after everyone left and the snow continued falling outside, I sat quietly beside the fireplace, watching the flames dance, thinking, remembering, feeling grateful. Because the greatest inheritance Richard ever left wasn't wealth, it wasn't property, it wasn't investments. It was a lesson, a simple lesson. One Daniel finally understood. And soon, all of us would understand it too. 1 year later, I found myself standing in my kitchen before sunrise. The house was quiet. The coffee was brewing. And for the first time in a very long time, peace felt natural instead of temporary. A year, 12 months, 365 days. It wasn't enough time to erase everything that happened. Some wounds never disappear completely, but it was enough time for healing to take root. And healing, I've learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in small moments. Phone calls, shared meals, honest conversations, forgiveness practiced repeatedly. 1 year earlier, my family had been falling apart. Now we were learning how to live together again. Not perfectly, authentically. That afternoon, I was hosting dinner, not because it was a holiday, not because there was a special occasion, simply because I wanted everyone together. The guest list was small. Family, the people who mattered, the people who remained, the people who loved one another even after disappointment. As I prepared the dining room, I paused for a moment and smiled. The table wasn't large. It wasn't expensive. It certainly wasn't impressive, but it was enough. That realization felt important. For years, Daniel believed bigger meant better. Now both of us understood a deeper truth. Enough is a beautiful thing. By late afternoon, cars began arriving. The first person through the door was Sophie, now 13 years old, slightly taller, slightly wiser, still carrying the same enormous heart. Grandma, she hugged me tightly, just as she always had. Some things should never change. You've grown again, she grinned. Dad says the grocery bill agrees. I laughed. A few moments later, Daniel entered carrying 2 casserole dishes. I stared, then laughed again. A year ago, you would have hired a chef. He smiled. A year ago, I would have ruined the casserole. Did you? We'll find out. The warmth between us still surprised me sometimes. Not because forgiveness was impossible, because I once thought it was. Yet here we were, not restored to what we had been. Something better, more honest, more mature, more real. The rest of the family arrived gradually. Conversations filled the house. Laughter echoed through the rooms. Life happened. Simple life. Beautiful life. As dinner approached, everyone gathered in the dining room. And that's when I noticed something. No assigned seating, no reserved positions. No hierarchy, no special treatment. People simply sat where they wanted, beside the people they loved, exactly as it should be. I looked around the table, my sister talking with Sophie, my cousins sharing stories, Daniel helping serve food, nobody competing, nobody performing, nobody trying to prove anything. The contrast nearly brought tears to my eyes, because I remembered another table, a different table, a table that measured value through status, a table that separated people, a table that nearly destroyed a family. This table united one. The difference wasn't furniture, it was perspective. Dinner lasted nearly 3 hours. Stories flowed. Memories surfaced. Laughter became frequent. At one point, Sophie convinced everyone to play a game involving old family photographs. The results were disastrous and hilarious. Several embarrassing pictures of Daniel appeared, including one where he attempted to cut his own hair at age 9. The room erupted. Even Daniel laughed. Especially Daniel. Watching him laugh at himself felt surprisingly emotional, because pride can't survive where humility lives. And humility had finally found a permanent home in him. Later in the evening, after dessert, the room gradually settled. Conversations softened. People relaxed. The kind of comfortable silence that only exists among people who truly belong together. Then Daniel stood. Immediately, every eye turned toward him. He smiled nervously. Some habits never disappear. Public speaking still made him instinctively straighten his shoulders. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was family. And somehow, that made it harder. He raised his glass. "I'd like to say something." The room grew quiet. I watched him carefully. Not because I feared what he'd say, because I wanted to hear it. Daniel looked around the table, then directly at me. For a moment, emotion interrupted his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. 1 year ago, I thought I understood what wealth meant. Silence filled the room. I was wrong. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. I thought wealth was money, houses, cars, status. He smiled sadly. I spent years chasing those things. A pause followed. Then I almost lost the things that actually mattered. The room remained completely still. Family has a way of listening differently when truth enters the room. Daniel continued. My mother taught me something. I immediately shook my head, but he ignored me, as sons often do. She taught me that character matters more than success. Another pause. That gratitude matters more than recognition. And that family matters more than pride. His eyes met mine, the same eyes I'd looked into when he was born. The same eyes I once feared had become unrecognizable. Now they looked familiar again. Not because he'd become a child, because he'd become himself. The best version of himself. I hurt people. His voice softened. I hurt the person who loved me most. The room remained silent. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. My eyes filled with tears, not from pain, from honesty, real honesty, the kind that asks for nothing, the kind that exists simply because it's true. Daniel raised his glass slightly higher. But because of her, he looked directly at me. I got a second chance. The room applauded softly. Not dramatically, not performatively, just genuine appreciation. The kind that can't be purchased, the kind that has to be earned. Afterward, people gradually returned to conversation. But I remained seated, thinking, watching, feeling. Richard would have loved this evening, not because everything was perfect, because it wasn't. Life never is. But because the lesson finally landed, the lesson he'd spent years trying to teach, the lesson Daniel finally learned. Several hours later, after everyone left, Daniel stayed behind to help clean up. We washed dishes together, just like we had months earlier. Except this time, there was no tension, no uncertainty, only comfort. At one point, he glanced toward the dining room. You know what I realized? What? He smiled. Nobody cared where they sat. I laughed softly. No, they only cared who they sat with. The simplicity of that statement nearly broke my heart, because it captured everything, absolutely everything. Later, after Daniel left, I sat alone at the table, the same table where our family had just shared dinner, the same table where nobody was excluded, the same table where healing happened. I looked around the room, then toward a framed photograph of Richard. For a moment, I imagined what he would say. Probably something wise, something simple, something true. Instead, I whispered my own answer. We made it. The room remained silent, but somehow I felt him there, and I smiled. Because after everything that happened, I finally understood something. The richest person in a family is not the one with the biggest house, not the one with the most money, not the one with the most influence. The richest person is the one surrounded by love when the money disappears. And on that quiet evening, sitting at a simple table in a modest home, I realized I had been rich all along. Life has a strange way of teaching us what truly matters. Sometimes those lessons arrive gently. Other times they arrive through heartbreak, disappointment, and loss. This story was never really about money. It was about gratitude. It was about remembering the people who stood beside us before success arrived. Too often, we spend years chasing achievement and forget the hands that helped us climb. We begin measuring worth through income, status, titles, or possessions. But none of those things can hug you when you're hurting. None of those things can forgive you when you've made mistakes. None of those things can replace genuine love. Real wealth is found in relationships. Real success is found in character. Real strength is found in humility. Eleanor's greatest victory was not protecting family assets. It was protecting the values those assets were meant to serve. Daniel's greatest achievement was not building a business empire. It was learning how to become a better son, a better father, and a better human being. Forgiveness does not erase the past. It does not pretend the pain never happened. Forgiveness creates the possibility of a better future. And sometimes, when people are willing to accept responsibility, face the truth, and change. Families can heal in ways that once seemed impossible. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to forgive someone you deeply loved? Do you believe family relationships can truly heal after betrayal? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, resilience, second chances, and emotional healing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that remind us what truly matters in life.